everyone's had your coffee, tea, and ready for a fantastic second day of the Standard Summit. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming back and not running away. So today we're going to start with a general session just as we did yesterday. We're going to build on what we covered yesterday and move forward with more policy. We are hoping that your day yesterday was filled with, as we're calling it, shared vision for a better world. Hope you felt that. And today we're going to add festivity and celebrations to the mix with an awards event later at 6 p.m. at Chaos. Everyone is invited. Please don't miss out on this fun event. So this morning's general session, as I said, builds on yesterday's session on policy. Today we will hear about the use of AI in IICRC standards. Our speaker today is IICRC Standards Chair Brandon Burton, and he is joining us virtually. This session will be recorded and made available after the summit. A little bit about Brandon. Throughout his 30-plus year career in the restoration industry, Brandon has worked to support rapidly developing technology and industry best practices with a passion for promoting the restoration industry's continued growth and professionalism. Brandon is the Senior Principal of Industry Relations for CoreLogic and previously filled the role of Technical Director for Legend Brands. He currently serves as Standards Chair for IICRC and Vice Chair for the S500 consensus body. And with that, please help me welcome Brandon Burton.
All right. Thank you so much, Millie, and thank you to all of our volunteers and consensus body members that are with us here at the event today. I'm excited to talk about this topic. This is something that I have been heavily engaged in, not only in and around standards, but for what I do for, kind of day in and day out as a living in the software space. And it's been a massive learning curve for me, not only professionally, but even with family and kids and all the things that I think all of us are dealing with as this technology and really this world of artificial intelligence is really manifested. And I've learned a ton. I think all of us have probably learned a ton. I have a ton to still learn. I'm not pronouncing myself as any sort of an expert in this field. However, I think there are several really critical topics that have surfaced over the course of the last couple of years that are very important for us as an organization to really think about and ensure that we're continuing to develop what we have as best practices for how artificial intelligence plays into the standards world. And to kind of kick this off and to start this off, I want to talk a little bit about just how kind of society as a whole understands, recognizes, or interacts with artificial intelligence just for a moment before we roll into anything technical. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about a Gallup poll that was conducted in the United States last year, because it's really revealing. There was a poll that was done, a Gallup poll that was done of 4,000 U.S. adults. So this is U.S. specific, but likely is very applicable across the globe. But with these 4,000 adults, they asked all of them, how many of you have used an artificial intelligence tool of any sort in the last 7 days? And the respondents of the 4,000, 65% of them said that they had not used a tool supported by AI or based on AI, or they were unaware if they did. They then asked the same 4,000 people if they had used 6 very specific tools, common tools that are powered by AI. And the interesting result was that 99% of those respondents had used one of those tools in the last 7 days. Not only had 99% of them used one of those tools, but at the same time, the majority of those respondents had used 5 or 6 of those tools, which, if you do the math on that, that means 65% of Americans are using artificial intelligence and are completely unaware. So to kind of set that up, now we'll roll into the presentation itself. and talk a little bit about AI. You're interacting with AI on a regular basis and may not even be aware of it. I'll just give you a short list here of some examples. Siri, Google Assistant, Amazon Alexa, the camera on your smartphone is using AI. I don't know how many of you have realized you've become much better photographers over the course of the last couple of years without learning anything about photography, and that's because your phone, your smartphone, is taking pictures that sometimes look better than the reality of what they're taking a picture of because AI is powering that. Your music streaming services, your TV streaming services, these are all using AI to power the suggestions that are coming up inside of those applications. Even things like bank fraud detection, your credit scoring, these are all now very much powered by AI. Even your credit worthiness and how that's predicted and the score that results from that. Your e-commerce recommendations that you're getting when you're shopping in something like Amazon, your Google searches, your navigation systems. If you use an application like Waze in order to drive from point A to point B, and it's suggesting different routes and drive times, the amount of time it's going to take, all of that is being modeled off of AI systems. Your support and chat systems, your social media platforms, and your connection suggestions and the content that's streaming through those social media platforms. All of this is being powered by AI systems. So we're interacting with it not only regularly, but more and more regularly, and it's a technology that is going to continue to integrate itself into society and all of the ways that we interact with the world, that we interact with each other. Again, the reason why I want to start by stressing this is, if going back to that Gallup poll, there is a reality that AI is a part of what we do. AI is everywhere around us. And it's not a matter of choosing whether or not to use or interact with AI. The reality is that we are. And because we are, it's critical to have a better understanding of what AI is, the influence that it can or cannot have, and how to properly interact with just this new world that's around us. So we'll start that off by talking a little bit about just what AI is. That's going to be our first conversation. Then we're going to get a little bit into the legal landscape of AI. And again, I'm not professing myself to be the expert here, but I am going to report out the stuff that I'm being exposed to and what's influencing me as standards chair to understand the reality of our world of standards to the best of my ability. Then we'll get into IICRC policy specifically, and I want to close out the presentation today. Once we get through what it is in the legal landscape and the policy, I want to talk a little bit about operational best practices. And I'm even going to pull up an AI model. We're going to do a couple little practice questions in AI and talk a little bit about the kind of the do's, the don'ts, the good, the bad, and the ugly as it relates to using AI specifically in the world of standards. Okay, so that's kind of the roadmap and where we're going. So let's start with this. What is artificial intelligence? I've heard a lot of jokes about the phrase artificial intelligence and whether or not the word intelligence really needs to be there. But regardless of what you feel about artificial intelligence, let's dissect a little bit, not getting super technical, but dissect a little bit under the hood of what we mean when we say artificial intelligence. And probably the best definition I found for it was a group called the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's founded in 1961. It's 38 member countries that all participate together to support, growth in economics globally. This entity defines AI as a machine-based system that, for explicit or implicit objectives, and that's critical, infers how to generate outputs. And what we mean by inference is converting an input into predictions, into content, into decisions, generating either a predictive or a generative output so that you have something as a byproduct of that input that is based on kind of the structure of what makes AI what it is. And then we'll get into that in just a second. There are some components to the workflow of AI. There is an input, obviously, that's what we are giving it. It's commonly referred to as a prompt. That's the question we are asking, the information we are posting to it. There is then processing that occurs with that input. That's based on algorithms. It's based on running that information through models. It's running that information through the machine side of what AI is. And then there's an output, and that is the response that we're getting from the AI system. The input, processing, and output, I'm not going to get super deep into this, but there are parts of this that we need to understand because they directly relate to the operational best practices and the policy language that we're going to talk about. And that's where I kind of want to dissect this for a second. One of the key pieces in artificial intelligence is understanding how artificial intelligence learns, how it grows, the training data, if you will, that affects the outputs that are coming out of the artificial intelligence system. And to look at this, I'm going to talk about specifically for a second something that we call generative AI. This would be something like ChatGPT or Midjourney or Gemini. These are very common AI systems or AI tools that would be available that in kind of the traditional sense of what most of us think of when we think of AI, and that's going to a browser prompt with an AI tool and putting in a prompt or asking a question of one of these tools. The training data that builds that AI, it originates from a couple of different sources. One of the originating sources of that training data is the data that is intentionally placed into that system. It is controlled. It is information that is being intentionally selected to build a database for that AI system. The organization that I work for actually has done some of this type of work for closed environment AI systems, where we are grabbing a library or a database of very specific information, and we're training an AI system very specifically on very specific information because we know that we're looking for a certain level of intelligence or a certain level of response coming out of that system. And that's generally where it starts. However, as an AI system grows, one of the things that continues to train that model is the information that is fed to that system over time. When you go to an AI model, especially a public AI model, and you feed that system with information, with text, with documents, with information, even your prompts in and of themselves, and the follow-ups that you ask in relation to those prompts based on the responses that it gets. That system continues to learn, it continues to consume that information, it continues to digest that information. I want to pause there for a second and just kind of have everybody reflect on this for a moment. I don't know how many of you have done this, but I know this is the experience that I've had. Very commonly, I have gotten responses as I've used AI, and I'll talk about some of the ways that I use it later on in the presentation, but I have very commonly gotten responses that have really shocked or surprised me for the amount of information that an AI model has available within its library that is based on IICRC content, that is copyrighted, that is protected, but it's still being interpreted by, digested by, and spit back to me in a language that is not existent within the documents directly. And it's a very alarming response to see that. I can remember in one case in specific example, very shortly after the S700 fire standard had published, very shortly, within weeks of it publishing, and I was doing research specific to wildfire restoration. I had not asked a question about the S700. I had not asked a question about structure fires specifically. I was doing research specific to wildfire and authoritative resources for wildfire. And I got specific section citations that came back to me from the S700 when I made those prompts, even though there was no mention of IICRC, there was no mention of S700 or anything of that like in the prompts that I was feeding the AI system. That should raise a flag. And as we go through the conversation today, I want that flag to kind of stick because we, as stewards of these standards and as volunteers, we have a very explicit responsibility to mitigate that experience from occurring for other users that are using AI systems. And that's a big part of what we're going to unpack today, especially when we get into policy. There are two major types of AI systems in the traditional sense. One is generative AI. I just want to touch on this real briefly. Specifically focused on creating new content. Again, these are things like ChatGPT and Midjourney. And generally, the way a system like this works is that it's trained on vast quantities of existing writings and images and other works. The outputs generally are used to create new text or new images or new works that are in response to those prompts. And the risk with this is that when you use these types of tools, I'm going to give you a very specific legal case on this in just a moment, but when you use these types of tools, there's a substantial risk that the AI is going to return something to you as an output that is going to very closely mimic copyrighted work. And if we're not doing our research in the traditional sense and we're not taking a look at the sources that the AI is using to generate those outputs, it can be very easy to create legal problems with infringement upon copyright if you use that output without doing that research. And that's a really important thing to note and to understand as you're using AI even outside of standards, as you're using those tools, is you have to be careful about those outputs. The ability for that AI system to properly filter what is and is not of appropriate copyright protection is far from a perfect model. And again, we'll take a look at some legal cases on that in just a moment. Another type of AI is predictive. Predictive AI, an example of that would be something like Python, is a different type of AI model. It analyzes existing data to forecast future outcomes or classify information. Kind of the goal with these types of systems is to predict what will happen next based on historical patterns, probabilities, numbers, categories. A great example of this would be something like Waze. If you use that for navigation, as it looks at the data for traffic and traffic patterns and routes, and then uses that to predict the amount of time that will be necessary for you to go from point A to point B with the different routes that it's suggesting coming back to you. So different types of AI systems, different types of just kind of the network of the way that these AI systems think. So I'm going to pause there on the technical side of AI, and I'm going to start to kind of dive into the world of the legal landscape of AI. And I want to give you a couple of very, very specific kind of legal cases where AI, at least in my understanding, as I've gone into this world and tried to do my research and better understand it, where I really had a major paradigm shift in how I understand the legal context of AI. So we'll get into those two legal cases. Kind of the output of the legal world, this is coming from the U.S. Patent Office predominantly, but the legal precedent is that U.S. courts and the U.S. Copyright Office maintain that a valid copyright claim requires human authorship. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that an AI tool cannot own work and cannot take legal responsibility for work. Two very, very different statements in that sentence, both of which are uber critical. So first, you cannot have ownership of AI from an AI system, right? Or ownership of copyright from an AI system. So if it was generated by Gemini, Gemini cannot own the work that was created by Gemini. It cannot be copyrighted by Gemini or anyone else as an output of human authored work. Secondarily, the AI also cannot take legal responsibility. So if you produce something using an AI model, then you use that content from that AI model. You can't say, well, I don't have any responsibility to this message or this content or this information. The AI system generated that information. And the way that the court systems work is that blame or that responsibility cannot be assigned to that AI model. All right. It's going to be assigned to the use of that work, and you are tied to the use of that work. A couple of additional things that I want to dive into in the legal before we get into some specifics. There was a case, Thaler versus Perlmutter, confirmed that works authored autonomously by AI are not eligible for protection. We're going to unpack that in just a moment and get a bit deeper into that. And there is no tool defense, meaning prompts alone do not constitute sufficient human control to claim authorship. So let's unpack that a bit by getting into two very specific cases. Both of these cases deal with art, and I know that our world predominantly deals with literature, with written works. But I thought that these two cases, even though they're dealing with art, they really manifest, I think, what's going to be critical as we get into the policy side of this in just a moment. The first one is actually a comic, Zarya of the Dawn. There were several images that were created inside of this comic using an AI tool called Midjourney. The finding is that initially, that the work could be copyrighted. Initially, that was the finding. The creator of this particular comic submitted the comic for copyright protection. It was copyrighted. However, it was then discovered that AI was used to generate some of the art within the comic. Once the U.S. Copyright Office became aware that AI was involved, they automatically revoked the copyright protection. Initially, they fully revoked the copyright protection, and then after an appeal by the author of the work, the final finding was that the only thing that was protected within that comic was the text that was generated by the author and the exact layout of the artwork within the comic. Those were the only two things that could be protected because they were the only two things that were done by sole human creation. To get a bit deeper into the artwork side of it, there was a piece that was created in 2022 by a gentleman named Jason Allen that he submitted to an art fair. And the piece is the one that you see on the slide right here. It was called the Theatre de Opera Spatial. He won an award with this piece of art at this particular art fair and submitted the art for copyright protection. Initially, the copyright protection was just denied, flat out denied, because he did share that he used AI to generate the art. So he appealed. And when he appealed, this is the part that gets really interesting. When he appealed, he said, okay, I put in 624 independent prompts into this art to modify the art 624 times. I then took the art, put the art into Adobe Photoshop, and made an additional, X number of edits inside of Adobe Photoshop. Then I moved it into a third system, and I upscaled the image and modified the image further in a third system. The second two systems were full human input. He went through two appeals processes, and both of those appeals processes provided all of the documentation to show all of the human input that modified the image from AI. The U.S. Copyright Office still denied copyright protection, even after all of the evidence that was shown for the modifications that were made, because there was still substantive input into the generation of the work from an AI system initially with the creation of that art. I wanted to share that with you because one of the things that I think is really important for us to understand is that with the work that we're creating in standards, if your original work originates from an AI system, that original work is going to be not only substantively difficult, but likely impossible to protect should the IICRC or the industry need to protect that content. We'll talk a little bit about how important that copyright protection is for standards writing content and our documents in just a moment. But I first wanted to establish that even with something like this piece of art and the modifications that were made by the creator of this art and the detail that he went to try to stand up the human input that was used to modify this, copyright protection was still denied. And I want that to sit with you and just kind of stew because, again, 624 individual prompts to modify the image, 2 additional systems being used after the AI model to further edit and modify the art, and still copyright protection was not granted. Yep. All right, so with all of that said as the foundation, now let's get into kind of the meat and the potatoes of what we're here to talk about, and that is our policy as it relates to the use of AI. I want to start this off by talking a little bit about why this is important. Why is copyright protection important? Why is the consideration of the influence of AI on our works important for us as a body of standards volunteers? First and foremost, it's critical that we protect the single source of the official standard publication, right? And just again, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the experiences that I've had, and I'm sure many of you in the room have had similar experiences. But if any stakeholder of the document is being informed about the IICRC's standards through an interpretation that is being provided by an AI system or any other entity that is not using the exact language out of our standards, but representing that as the content of our standards, that creates tremendous risk for false interpretation or inaccurate interpretation, false claims for contents for what is and is not standard of care in the industries that we serve. So that protecting that single source of the official standard publication is critical. Also preserving the likeness of our standards of the title and the cover, right? In order to do that, we need to be able to stand up that these are human created works, right? We can't enforce copyright protection, just like the author of that art could not enforce copyright protection if it can be shown that there is a substantive amount of development that came from an AI tool. Our methods of content creation must therefore rely on, and this comes straight from the U.S. Patent Office, human authorship. In addition, it must be fruits of intellectual labor that are founded in the creative powers of the mind. And that's language that comes directly from the U.S. Patent Office. If those are not shown, then the U.S. Patent Office is now building case study after case study where copyright protection is not being enforced. Okay. AI systems and the integrity of our standards, just how, again, I want you to think as we go through this, how many of you have experienced that? How many of you have experienced the response that comes from an AI system that has surprised you about the amount of content that is actually being trained into these AI systems? So with that, let's roll into the policy itself. There are two parts of the policy that I want to talk about. One is the general AI policy, and this is not for standards specifically. This is for any individual who has purchased a license to our standards, who is using our standards. They have a subscription to the standards website. So this is a general policy that applies to standards at large. I'm going to read this paragraph out, and I want everybody to kind of ponder that, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about it. But here's the general policy. The IICRC prohibits the entry of its standards and related intellectual property into any form of artificial intelligence tools such as ChatGPT. Additionally, creating derivatives of IICRC published and draft standards using AI is also prohibited. If a licensee violates this AI use policy, the IICRC will suspend their access to intellectual property and further legal action will be considered. I wanted to start with this paragraph in the policy because I think it is really important. Understand that any insertion of IICRC standard content into an AI prompt is a violation of this policy. Right? A paragraph, a section, a subsection, if as a user of that document, not even as a standards volunteer, but as a user of that document, placing that content into an AI system's prompt is a violation of the policy. And it's not that we'll consider removing access to the content. We will remove access to the content to AI, IICRC's IP if that occurs, right? And if at least we're made aware of the fact of it occurring, which can be pretty hard to establish. But that will occur. In addition to that, further legal action will be considered. So that's the general policy. So even if you're not a consensus body member, but you're a subscriber to IICRC standards, you're using the S100, for example, and you decide that you want to drop that into an AI model so that you can write a report based on some work that you're doing, and you use the AI to interpret, the standard to help you draft that report, that is a violation of IICRC policy, black and white. Okay. In addition to that, this policy ensures that the AI is not used to redistribute or create new non-compliant versions of the IICRC's copyrighted work. And that's the reason why this is so important, right? The more AI is allowed to digest content and then prompted to create interpretations, to create revisions, to create summaries of that work, the more that influences the responses that are being received by others who are using those systems. right? That's the reason why when I started doing research on wildfire, I started getting information that came from the S700 standard within weeks of that standard being published. It's because this had already been done by someone, somewhere, or someone's multiple times. This had already been done. And because that was being done, the questions that they were asking, the prompts that they were asking, in addition to the content that they uploaded, resulted in the results I was seeing in the responses I was getting from that system, right? There were misinterpretations, there were misquotes, there was information that was not a part of that standard that I received in that response, something that the AI world calls hallucinations, right? That's dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. Can we prevent all of that from occurring? No. And I think that's important for us to understand. We can't fully prevent all of that from occurring across the globe, but we as standards volunteers can definitely not contribute to that occurring, which is a big part of the next part of the policy that I want to get into. As or for us as standards developers, as consensus body members, this is the part of the policy that applies directly to us. For standards development, again, I'll read this out and then we'll talk a little bit about it. The IICRC prohibits the use of generative AI to author or iterate on drafts or published standards. The violation of this policy can result in the termination of CB membership. Okay. It's pretty direct. It's a pretty direct statement. We're going to unpack that a little bit as we go through the rest of the policy. That's a pretty direct statement, and it's uber important. And here's the case that I want to build on this particular statement. If in the process, as a CB member, you're trying to create draft language for the S100, the S300, the S700, whichever document it is, and the AI system is aware that you're creating this draft content or creating content, and it's producing these drafts and interacting with you as you're producing this draft content. All of those prompts and all of that information is being stored into that model. And all of those prompts and all of that information is going to inform other responses that are going to occur from that system for future users of that AI system. That process is even more detrimental to the integrity of our standards than someone just pasting content directly from a published standard into that model. Using the system to draft content has an even greater risk of creating those hallucinations. So it's critical that we don't do that. So posting current content and then revising that content using an AI model, 100% restricted and should not be done. I'm going to talk a little bit about what can be done in just a moment, so we'll dig a little bit deeper into that, but really let that sink in. If using published standards creates a risk, as users of AI systems are asking questions for interpretations and summaries, even furthermore, using an AI system to draft content, review draft content, and summarize or modify draft content creates an even greater risk. A CB member may use the internet to include AI to research topics related to or summarize information on a specific topic. So the use of AI does have a proper use in the standards development process. And that proper use is in the research process, as we are exploring information to understand what information should be considered in the standards writing and development process. And there are some very effective ways to do that. There are some very proper ways to do that, in ways that I would encourage consensus body members to do using AI systems. And I'm going to show you some examples of that towards the end of the presentation today. For standards development continued, content published on the internet or generated by AI shall not be pasted directly into a draft. In other words, CB members and/or the CB shall create the content. The consensus body must be the author, right? The individuals on the consensus body must be the author. There are ways to use AI to collect information, to research information, to summarize information, but those summaries and those research works are not what end up in our documents. It's what we author when informed by that information that we place within our standards. Content authored by the CB shall not be substantially similar to content published on the internet or generated by AI. That substantially similar phrase is very, very critical. Okay, so it's not simply taking information presented by AI, pasting that into a Word document, modifying 3 or 4 words and reordering a couple of sentences, right? If the content is substantively similar and can be shown to be substantively similar, then we lose that copyright protection. Even if the AI had no idea that it was helping you draft content, in other words, for a particular standard. You never mentioned IICRC, you never mentioned, the S300, you never mentioned a subsection title. So you didn't use anything to create a breadcrumb that tied it to that document, but you still said, summarize the types of carpet that are manufactured in the use of residential buildings or used in residential buildings. You copy that into a draft document and then maybe reorder the bullets and change a couple of words and then put that within our standard. That is substantially similar to what was produced by the AI model, and that puts the copyright protection of the document at risk. Okay. Prompts or inquiry in using generative AI shall be general in nature and shall not include the titles of IICRC standards and publication numbers. And this is a really critical piece to this. When we do get into the things that we can do, one of the things you're going to notice that I hit on very, very hard is that when you do use an AI system to do research, to summarize information that is available out there through published works, through authoritative sources, it's really important that you don't mix into that titles of our documents, the IICRC or ANSI standards, or other things that are going to tie that work or that research together with the development of or the content of our standards. It's important not to make that bridge, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And then finally on this slide, prompts or inquiry shall never include draft or published language from the IICRC. I think we've hit on that one pretty hard, so I'll move forward. Next part of the policy, if generative AI tools have been used to research or summarize information that the consensus body member used to author content, they shall disclose that or disclose such to the consensus body. So when you do use AI in a form to do research, to find information, to find sources, disclose that to the consensus body, right? When you bring that information back, you bring that content back, disclose that. And that is a part of policy, all right? I used Google Gemini to do some research on the effect of water on building materials. The content that I'm presenting to the consensus body is my own authorship, but I did use Google Gemini to do some research. These are the sources that it returned for me that I used, right? So disclose that to the consensus body so the consensus body is aware that that was a part of the process. To kind of summarize the content there a little bit and talk a little bit not only about the consensus body, but a little bit of the other stakeholders to the process. As a consensus body member, you may use AI to research or summarize general topics. What you must not do is then copy that information directly into our standards or language that is substantively similar. You must disclose any usage of AI to the consensus body, and you must be the author and have responsibility for whatever content that you create based on that information. Just to talk about some of the other stakeholders to standards development processes for a moment. Reviewers, those that are in the public review process, the policy does address that as well. Reviewers are strictly restricted from using AI systems in their review process. Right, draft documents that are out in public review must not be placed into AI, and the responses and evaluations that come from a reviewer must be their own sole human expertise and judgment. AI must not be used. So that is explicitly discussed within the AI policy. And as far as our administrative staff and our wonderful administration that supports all of our meetings, the AI note-taking process from an AI system, to the extent that some of the tools allow us to turn it off, because in some cases it's impossible to turn off, but we are not allowed to use AI note-takers. And that's something we've been battling through or struggling with as we use things like Zoom. There are some elements of Zoom that are very difficult to turn off and some that are impossible to turn off. But the notes that are taken, the minutes that are taken for AI systems, those notes and minutes are generated by the administrative staff. They are not generated by any AI note-taking system. All right, those are human-created. The only reason that at any point that any of that has been referred to is if something was missed in attendance or something like that, and there's a data point like that that needs to be checked. But generally speaking, where possible or where allowable, it's turned off, and the note-taking is done by human hand. So let's talk a little bit now that we've talked about the policy. I want to talk a little bit about how to apply that policy and what good operational behavior is as it relates to AI. So let's kind of shift over into the second part of this conversation. So a couple of things that are not compliant based on the policy. What you would not want to ask an AI system is summarize Section 12 of the IICRC S500 regarding Category 3 water, right? That would be a very ill-advised prompt to put into an AI system and have it interpret information that is coming directly from a standard. Even worse yet is then to interact with that information and ask further prompts or inform that prompt because that is going to affect anybody else who is making a similar inquiry into that particular subject. Even worse would be to ask an AI system, hey, rewrite this paragraph for me that comes from the S500 to make it sound more professional, right? As I'm drafting my revision to the S500. These are all things that we want not only are they prohibited by policy, but those are the things that are going to have this detrimental impact on the proliferation of content that is being spewed out by AI systems to the other constituents of our industry, the other stakeholders in our industry that are not a part of the standards development process. Instead of that, what you could say is, what are the general scientific principles of, and again, I'm using a water example here for my water bias, and I apologize, but what are the general scientific principles of psychrometry related to evaporation rates? Right? If I'm a consensus body member and I'm considering revisions in a particular standard, there's no reason why I can't use an AI system, to go out and look at general technical information out there, bring that technical information back to me, and then consider that information as I look at my revisions that we're making to a standard. Notice in that prompt, that compliant prompt, I didn't say any standard title. I did not say IICRC. I did not say ANSI standard. I'm just generally asking for the AI system to help me go out and look at the World Wide Web and public resources that are out there and bring me back some technical information on this topic so I can read it, I can review it, and I'll talk about how to properly use that here in just a moment. But I can read it and review it, and it can inform some of the decisions that I'm making about standards revisions or standard development. Another example of something that would be compliant, list common health risks associated with sewage contamination in indoor environments, right? Completely harmless prompt. I read that information. I digest that information. I consider if there's information in that response that we may want to consider as a consensus body, right? What I don't want to do is copy that response and then place that information into the standard of care. So again, notes at the bottom here, even with compliant prompts, those results cannot be pasted directly into drafts. What I do end up writing in my drafts should not be substantively similar to those responses. And those prompts that I do enter into those systems must be generic. Don't include the IICRC document identification titles, don't include subsection titles, and don't include paragraphs from our standards within those prompts. So avoid the likeness of our standards and the content of our standards from being in those prompts. All right, moving forward. So not substantively similar. Let's talk a little bit more about that. The content generated by AI shall not be the content that is pasted into our standards. Our content shall be authored by our consensus bodies and our consensus body volunteers. We should not be directly pasting any of that content into our draft documents. And we shall take responsibility as consensus body members, take ownership and responsibility for what ultimately does end up in our documents by authoring that content. All right, be the author of that content. Another way to summarize kind of the do's and don'ts, do use AI to summarize broad topics found in the public, found on the internet through available resources. Do disclose to a consensus body if you've done so, and do fact check the information that is coming from an AI system by looking at sources and using AI responses to generate a list of sources that you can further then research. Don't ask AI to write a section of the standard for you. Don't copy and paste AI content directly into our documents. I know I'm hitting some of these multiple times, but it's critical. And don't ask an AI system, to improve content within a standard. So with that, I want to get into some examples of proper use of AI systems, and talk a little bit about, as a consensus body member, how I would suggest that we do use AI tools, but do it in a way that conforms with or is compliant with the policy that we just discussed. I'm going to close with this piece. We're going to do a couple of examples, and then once I close with this piece, we're going to roll into a Q&A here that'll round out the back end of our session. So to do this, I'm going to bring up Google Gemini. This is the AI tool that I commonly use for a lot of the work that I do when I do use an AI system. I'm in the camp where I believe that tools like this can be very important and powerful tools, as long as they're used in a way where we are properly informed, where we have the right guardrails to help us understand how we should and should not be using tools like this. And so to kind of manifest that, I want to start with just a couple of just very, very basic examples. And the first example that I'm going to start with is just the subject of clean. All right, and I'm going to ask Google Gemini a simple question. What is clean? All right, so if I'm a standards developer, if I'm a consensus body member, I might use something like this so that I can create some thoughts, some information, some sources that I might want to consider as I'm writing content. And maybe one of the things that we're developing as a consensus body, regardless of what document you're a part of, maybe you're having a discussion about the word clean and what clean means and how you're going to represent the word clean or stand that up within your document. So you might go to an AI system, just ask it, what is clean? What does it mean, right? By this first question, what I want to kind of call out here is that I'm getting a lot of different information that comes when I ask a simple question without context, right? And that's the first thing that I want to talk about for good operational use of AI, is that if you don't give an AI tool context, it's very difficult for that AI tool to understand, what you're actually trying to ask. So I'm slowly scrolling through this so you can kind of see the information that it's spitting back out at me. Some of it kind of relevant, some of it definitely not relevant, depending on the standard that you're working with. And the reason for that, and the reason why it's not giving me a whole lot of useful information, is because I didn't really ask it a very useful question, right? What is clean? That can mean a lot of things, right? So instead of just asking what is clean, I'm going to be a little bit more specific. And by being more specific, I'm going to post a different question. And what I'm going to say is, well, I don't want to just know what clean is. I want you to provide me definitions for the term clean. So now I'm going to ask for definitions of the word clean. And notice I'm getting a little bit more specific, right? And even though I've gotten more specific and I'm getting some actual definitions, there's still a lot of stuff in here that's not really relevant to to what I'm trying to look for. I'm trying to get into a discussion with my consensus body where what I really want is I want context for the word clean and authoritative sources for the word clean that are transferable or relatable to my industry or my industries, right? So maybe just understanding definitions wasn't enough. So let's get even more specific. And I'm going to paste one more question here in this particular kind of thought tree that we're going down. And instead of just asking for definitions, I want you to note all of the components of this prompt that I'm dropping in here. Provide authoritative definitions for the term clean. Cite the source for each definition beneath the response. Use only authoritative sources and published peer-reviewed literature. Notice how much more specific this prompt is and how I'm building the guardrails within this prompt for what I want the AI system to do. I'm building those guardrails in a couple of different ways. I want sources. I want a source beneath every response that it gives me for a definition. And not only do I want sources, I want authoritative sources that come from published peer-reviewed literature. The more specific I am in this response, the more useful that information is when I get that response back. Now, as the AI system ponders this and kind of digests that information, give it a second to do so, what I should get back here are going to be sources for the information that are going to be much more meaningful for me as I'm trying to kind of dig through this response and this information. Notice how much more specific this is getting now. Not only am I getting information that is much more authoritative, I'm getting information that's giving me direct quotes from those sources. I'm getting the list of the actual source where the information came from, so that if I need to dig into that and do some additional reading and review, I have that source there so that I can take a look at it. And the nice thing with Google Gemini is that as I review all of these, if I want to get into the actual sources, those sources, when I ask a prompt like this, those sources are being listed for me, so that I can then dive directly into that source, read it from the source, directly from the source, and then source information directly from those quotes if I need to into my standard development process. So this was an example using Clean. Hopefully that kind of set some helpful tips for you on how that might be used in that process. I want to do another one though with a slightly different topic. So as opposed to discussing a technical term like clean, let's discuss a technical term like carpet. What is carpet? And let's kind of walk through that same manifestation of going through iterations of this question. If I just asked the question, what is carpet? I did this one this morning. It was actually kind of fun as I read through some of the different levels of information that it was breaking out. And I learned a few things in the process that I think that were actually kind of interesting to understand as I might be a consensus body volunteer working on any of our standards that have carpet as being a component of the kind of the topic menu. So first, if I just ask what is carpet, all right, again, I get some pretty broad and basic information, some of it contextual to what might be important to me, some of it definitely not contextual. But also I want you to note, especially those of you that are senior carpet inspectors or involved in the S100 or other related standards that deal a lot with carpet, I want you to notice if you read through this, you might be able to pick out what we call artificial intelligence hallucinations, right? And some information in here that when you read this, I'm sure you'd want to arm wrestle with the AI system over the technical accuracy of some of the information. Having said that, I don't want to dig into the technical side of it real deeply here. What I do want to call out, though, is that as the information does come back to me, sources is the area where I would encourage, just as we did with the previous example, I would encourage that you focus when you're using an AI system. One of the most beneficial pieces to using an AI model is not necessarily the information the AI is interpreting, that it's spitting back to me in the responses. It's the sources it's using to find that information and then interpret from to give me that response. And that's part of the reason why when I'm using an AI system, again, I don't just ask, what is carpet? What I would ask is something more like this. Let me copy this and paste it into your domain response. And again, I'm skipping all the way down to a more thought out prompt here, like I did with the first example. So instead of just asking what is carpet, what I would encourage is to ask something more like this. List the types of carpet ordered by their frequency of use in residential buildings. Provide a source for each type of carpet that discusses the construction method. Cite the source beneath each response. Use only authoritative sources such as recognized research institutes, government bodies, standards writing organizations, and published peer-reviewed literature. I'm going to talk about that prompt for a second, and then I'm going to send it. A couple of things that are important about that prompt. First and foremost, notice the guardrails. Right? I'm trying to give the AI system the information that it needs, the context that it needs to find the kind of information that I would see as relevant for consideration as sources or as inspiration for subjects that my standard may want to address or consider, right? So I've got to give it those guardrails. In doing so, I am also not creating a bridge to IICRC. I'm not creating a bridge to S100. I'm not creating a bridge to any of the sections within any of our standards. I'm not creating a bridge even to ANSI, right? I am, however, mentioning that I want it to consider standards writing organizations, right? So if it returns information, I'm not associating that information with the standards writing organization, but it's still allowing it to look at what is publicly available from standard writing organizations. Now I'm going to hit send on this, and let's take a look at just how much more refined the response is that I'm going to get from this AI system. And then we'll close with this example, and just to give a heads up to the admin staff in the room, we'll roll to QA here in just a couple of minutes. So with that, I'm going to scroll through the response. Now notice that not only am I getting more refined responses, but as I asked, underneath all of these, I am getting citations for where the information comes from so that I can source that information more explicitly. I'm getting links to that information so that I can dive into those source documents. This is a much more meaningful response and much more valuable to me as a technical writer, as a content developer for standards. And again, the way that I'm going to use this information and consume this information is that none of this is going to end up in my draft content. None of this is going to directly revise my standard. It's going to inform my process for where I need to go find authoritative sources, which is a big part of standards development. It's going to inspire me to consider topics that may not have been addressed within my standard. But by doing so, I will review the sources of all of that information before any of that is ultimately considered, and it'll be the source that I use to develop and inspire my content, not the interpretation that comes from the AI model. All right, it's a thinking room. It's a sounding board. It's a way for me to ensure that I'm considering a breadth of topics that are outside of the vacuum of of just those things that I'm going to think of on my own, but it is not a place where we're going to write and develop content, and it's not a source that is going to be copied into our draft content material. All right, so hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that gives you some tips and tricks on the ways that you can use an AI system. A lot of the tools that I just discussed or the methods that I just discussed for these searches, I would say the same thing even if you're just doing a general Google search, because believe it or not, even a general Google search is in essence the same thing as using an AI system. So the explicit nature of my prompt, the guardrails of my prompt, and the way I'm going to consume that information and rely on sources for the results that I get. That's a universal kind of tool for effective use of information and research that we could apply not only to something like Google Gemini, but even for general searches across the internet for information as we develop our courses, or not our courses, but our standards. So with that, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to roll back to the presentation itself. With this portion, what I'd like to do is we're going to open the floor for questions. As we go into opening the floor for questions, it's going to be really critical that you hold to ask your question until you have the mic in hand. I believe Millie and others are going to walk around the room with the mic. Some of those questions will be answered right there on site, and where possible or where available, I'll provide any additional context if the question is directed directly to me.
What consideration was given, I got like maybe a two-part question. So what consideration was given to AI models that can be used in a closed setting? As an example, ChatGPT, you can turn off so that you for that particular conversation, that data is private, then deleted, and is not used for the learning process or the building of the model.
Yeah.
Also, overall, I follow a lot of AI. Some might say it's the wave of the future. It's destroying the internet with all the junk data that's being put out there. 50% of everything is junk from AI. I get there's a lot of downsides. It kind of seems like the perspective of IICRC, or the direction that we've taken then, is to just avoid and hope that this goes away. Why have we chosen that model instead of trying to get ahead of it and maybe take control of the situation and offer a closed AI model that is owned and controlled by the IICRC so that AI tools and availability are still available versus just like a quick word search?
It's amazing in your question that those are the same exact questions that are being discussed within the IICRC. So I just want to acknowledge that. And start by my response by saying that this policy is a living policy. At present, right, at the current time, the policy is that no standard content shall be generated by, placed into, or copied from an AI system. That's the black and white policy. That's understanding two major pieces of information. Number one, that currently there is not an AI tool that the IICRC has licensed in a closed environment. That's number one. That's not to say that's not going to happen in the future, right? So if there is a point in time where there is a closed model environment that can be made available to the consensus bodies for the generation of content. Some of that policy may modify at that particular point in time because we have that tool available. Right now, we don't have that available, so the policy is written from the context of that not being available. Okay, so that's part of it. The second part of it is that even if a closed environment AI tool is made available to our standards writing organization, we still run the concern or have the concern for copyright protection, notwithstanding that being a closed environment, right? Regardless of whether or not it's an open environment or a closed environment, which addresses part of the problem, what it doesn't address is the copyright protection element. If a standard is developed substantively with the use of an AI model, even in a closed system, we run a substantial risk for not being able to enforce copyright protection. So as we go forward, and as this is a bit of a living policy, and as we understand as an organization the technology better, I can guarantee there will be modifications to the policy. Those modifications, however, are going to have to consider both of the sides of that coin, right? One, the protection of the integrity of the content, closed versus open AI tool, and then secondarily, the ability to enforce copyright protection, which is ambivalent to whether or not it was an open or closed system.
Things I've always relied on is the history of the IICRC, the technical teams that helped develop a lot of the standards, and so I rely on a lot of that. The issue is, for me, has come in questioning the reliability or even my own technical writing of the past, where I've now incorporated, at least asked AI for more information, and it's sort of broadened my focus or my brain that's saying, I don't know my subject as well as I thought I did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I then tried to research, like you said, where did that information come from that maybe I can use as a technical writer or as a glossary writer, that I can say that that's a reliable source. Even some of the government sources that I look at and that I get back is then I try to link onto them, and it's old information, and the link is no longer valid. So I find that even some of my government sources from EPA's, CDC, et cetera, I can't find that information anymore, even though it provides it as a source reference. I don't know if you provide us with any guidance on that, other than caution about researching, not just or putting down that this is the source, but relying that it's a currently available source for us to use.
And that'll alleviate many of those problems, at least in the the context of current technical writing. That doesn't address the problem of the fact that technical literature that you wrote, as you mentioned, Pat, once that technical literature is 5, 6, 7, 10, 20 years old, it doesn't mean that those resources are still publicly available or that it's the most current information. But at least in current technical writing, if you get a response that says, according to the US EPA, 1 + 1 = 2, then go to the US EPA and see where it says 1 + 1 = 2, right? And then get that link on the page that you're visiting if you want to link to that information, right? Don't take the quote out of an AI response and say the US EPA said this because Gemini told me. Okay, that's a really important comment, Pat, and a very, very good question. Thank you.
With in the college and university, when we have students turn in projects, typically depending on where you work at, we put it into turnitin.com to look for AI generated text. There's others, as I'm sure you're aware, like academic AI, that are really good, but even those show many times text that was not AI generated as AI generated. It's recognized. But in order to do that, we're putting the works into AI. So how will the IICRC check for AI generated text without putting it into AI? Or, in other words, that's one question. The other one is, how are you going to distinguish between AI-generated text and human-generated text when it shows up from an AI detector as AI-generated?
Yeah. By having a policy that says, thou shalt not do this, right? The policy is not stating that we are also going to validate all content, to, against a system to validate that it was not generated by AI. The policing is just like with our standards in and of themselves, the IICRC does not necessarily police standards. We don't have an arm that allows for the policing of those standards. It's not to say we aren't going to take legal action where it's needed if there is misconduct in the industry, but we don't enforce the standards, right? Much with this policy, we will police the policy in as much as it is reported that there are violations of this policy, and we will take action where it is reported that there are violations of this policy and we have evidence of that violation. But the process is not going to be taking each approved draft and running that approved draft through an AI checking tool, right? It's the minutes from each consensus body meeting. It's the revisions that we have through track change history that are made. It's the reporting that is done by consensus body members about their sources and their information that will be relied upon to establish that it was human-generated content. So I know it's not the most ideal answer, Brandon. Probably not 100% what you're looking at with the question. Having said that, the nice thing about that being the methodology, at least at present, is that also prevents us from having to put full draft content into an AI system to check for AI content. So at least it does address one side of the question. But that is the way it would be enforced, at least initially. And again, I'll close that response by saying, this is a living policy. As we learn more and as we become more informed, as industries and other standard writing entities, for that matter, learn how to better manage this world of AI, that policy will continue to mature and grow, and it will become more and more informed. And as I started the presentation with, I'll be the first to acknowledge, I'm not the AI expert, and there are many of you in the room that likely know more about that world than I do. And I'll cancel the word likely, that do know more about that world than I do. And we are a village that together needs to grow our ability to develop standards in the world in which we live. So all feedback and all additional information not only is considered, but greatly appreciated. So great question, Brandon. Thank you.
And if you're wondering, where is this AI use policy? It's in your email. Thank you to Cheryl Smith for sending it out to all CBs this morning in a very timely fashion. So the new AI use policy has been shared with all CBs. We will also include it in your reference documents folder along with the updated policy document that we discussed yesterday. I do want to take one quick step back to yesterday's presentation before I lose the thought, because I know we talked a lot about what chairs and vice chairs can and should be doing to be more inclusive and to make sure that we have true consensus and every voice on the consensus body is heard. I want to flip that coin and say that, there is a tremendous responsibility that also lies with consensus body members to participate actively, to attend meetings on a regular basis, and to provide your input to come prepared to every meeting.